There's Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And this week I'm tempted to talk about crewing, or as in other countries it's referred to as rowing. And I'll tell you why when I get there. But in the first place, I wanted to say something about the contribution of WEFT and Urbana Public Television in putting these sorts of programs together. We're doing it remote. It's much easier to do this in a studio where we have microphones that can pick you up remote, and we can videotape our program. And we have two venues here. One is sound, which in radio terms is very nice. If you listen to a radio program, you have the capacity to dream and imagine. So there's a value to a radio. But we also videotape that program, and you get to see me, and that to some extent is helpful because you have a nonverbal communication. If I wave my arms about, you know, and if I have guests, I can have them do that. Then that's picked up by Urbana Public Television and put up on Channel 6 2 times a week and up on YouTube, and we can have links to send information to specific people if necessary. In remote with the virus, we have tried to do things differently. We did a cell phone to cell phone, and cell phones actually aren't as crisp and clean as single lens reflex cameras and the like. And the sound is a problem because you're 3 feet away from your cell phone. And we're avoiding that. And Jason has kindly come from UPTV and has a zoom camera which sits on top of your computer, and it is about a foot away from my image. And he's also brought a microphone which will be better than cell phone to cell phone. So this is somewhat experimental this week, but I sort of want to let you know that this is Urbana Public Television doing this for both Champaign and Urbana, and we want to respect that, because if we don't, we might just lose it. Champaign has some of the same facility, but they don't do it for both jurisdictions, which are together, for those people who don't know that Champaign and Urbana are twin cities. So I'll say that this is archived both for sound and for video. It's on YouTube, and there are other programs that do this on WAFT. The WEF sessions does it too, and we do this in the virus era, but we've also done it in the era of having to join a new tower, and in political situations that are quite different than the norm. And so thanks for listening this in different ways. But that's all I wanted to say. But respect the fact that I've been lucky enough to have uh, radio engineers, Bill Saylor and David Witzani, and both those people have been able to put visual material into our video program, so you just don't see uh, me as the monk. You see the information that we might not be able to take you to. If Rantoul is 18 miles away, or if Clinton is 45 miles away, or Cisco is 30 miles away, people can't just go there and find themselves. With maps and charts and information, it's rather wonderful to see 6 butterflies on a prairie plant. So sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. That doesn't mean that the words aren't important, but it is in an internet era a huge advantage to have visuals. Today I'm going to do something different because I think we're experimenting with our new equipment, and I'm going back to rowing. I listened to a program on WILL that dealt with a team of back people in Chicago. I think the leader probably also was a black person. This is in fairly raunchy neighborhoods, and they decided to do something with rowing. And I listened with interest because I used to row, and it's different for different people, but this was a fairly sophisticated rowing system, and eventually the black community was behind this crew. It varied from time to time, but this crew joined a fairly sophisticated organization, which was mainly white. And how did you do that? And in the process, they got to be at national level races, and in one race, which they were almost about to win, somebody caught a crab. And I know very well what a crab is. It's catching your oar in lack of synchronization with 8 people in a boat. Let me explain boats. I grew up in the boondocks, and their boat was a flat-bottom boat put together probably at home with planks and cork and tar, and it was flat because our rivers were little streams and you didn't have a lot of deep water. But my father was a school teacher, and if it rained significantly, those little streams coming off over the mountains that we're in flooded very quickly. And if you didn't let students go home quickly, they might not get home. But if they did get to a swollen creek, they could pick up a boat that had rowlocks, so you had oars, and you might also have a pole nearby, which would allow you to punt it across the stream. If you were lucky and the river hadn't come up very quickly, you might have a plank. It usually was a fallen log that would go from bank to rock to bank, and it was flattened at the top, so the plank might be 12 inches across, but a little bit of flatten on the, so you could run across it if you were used to doing that. If my mother wanted to walk across that, she had to have a pole to support her because she was not used to that sort of height. But there, sitting in the background, was usually a boat. The river was not suitable for uh, canoeing, lots of gravel and lots of portages. Uh, I'm sure people do that. At the open end near the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, there was boat building and coastal boats, and some of the forest trees that were on our mountain would be taken down to Bellingen, and their coastal boats would be built. Now, I grew up and go to boarding school because there was no near high school, and I go to Sydney, and I go to an agricultural high school, and then go to the university. And I have a buddy. He was school captain, but he was also my friend, and we did a lot of things together. And we went to University of Sydney, and the University of Sydney. My buddy Lex Ewell went into dentistry. Lex was a little more sophisticated than I was. I was not used to city living. If it rained, I would take off my shoes and put them under my coat and walk with bare feet, which was sort of what you would do in the country, but you didn't do that in the city. So there were some gum tips on my background, but Lex was rather a wonderful friend, and he lived not too far away from where I was boarding, and we met a lot. Then he went to college, and at college he joined up with crews that were doing rowing. So each college, if there are 4 or 5 colleges at the university, they would all have rowing teams, and they would have regattas. So now I have to explain to you what a boat is for rowing people. A boat for rowing, say the Sydney Rowing Club, would be an 8 or a 4, where you would have 8 people. And this is really a shell. It's about 20 feet long, or perhaps longer than that. And you have a rib in the middle. And when you get in to sit on your rowing stool, you had to stand on that rib, that keel. The rest of the boat was very finely carpentered plywood. And this boat was about 2 feet wide and very long. It had a coxswain, and the coxswain would have a rudder to steer the boat. The coxswain would be looking forward, and he would be at the back of the boat. The 8 people who had oars would be facing backward to the way you're going. But they would all put their oar in at the same time. Not always easy to do. That's why you have a coxswain. The coxswain has a shouting device, and he would call the numbers so that you would, a little bit like the railroaders having songs to move a piece of railroad steel, all operating at the same time. Well, this boat would do the same thing. So you had 8s, and you sat your tail, your bottom, on a pedestal that was shaped more or less for your bottom, but it was on runners, so that when you grabbed the oar, you pushed your legs backwards and move the oar not only with your arms to your chest and up and then back forward again. Uh, uh, that was aided by places to put your feet, and you had shoes that prevented you from uh, slipping. Uh, but that was a lot of work. You had a rock where the oar went through, and so it was kept in place. The oar was probably 8 or 10 feet long, and with a paddle on the end, which more or less was uh, Constitution regulation size, although some crews decided to make them a little different. If you were all heavy duty people, then you could probably work with a slightly more cupped and slightly more extensive blade. There was always a lot of debate about the size of the blade and what you did, but there was some flexibility there. You wore shorts, and under the shorts you wore usually women's underwear from what I forget the style, but it was a rather slippery material, and it prevented you from getting blisters on your tail. So you had to know these things. You went into a shed where these sorts of equipment were kept upside down on racks. You always made sure that if you were in salt water, you washed the salt water off. If you were in muddy fresh water, you did the same. When you did that, you had a retinue whereby all 8 participants took hold of that shell and treated it very well and put it on the rack. There were also fours. The fours didn't have a coxswain, and the coxswain was always very small. Sometimes it was female, so very lightweight, not adding to the weight of the boat or the shell. And that coxswain was sitting on a permanent seat that didn't move. That was not going to be forward and back. There were fours that had to face differently so that you really knew where you were going. But then there were skiffs. There were twos, then there were skiffs. And the skiffs had 2 oars so that you have, instead of having 1 oar with 1 person, you had 2 oars, and you could move at a tremendous pace with that skiff. It was almost like you were traveling on the top of the water. This sort of thing was very famous in England. There were Oxford and Cambridge would have regattas, and it would be a very national level event with women dressed up and picnics and support, and it was as you got colonialism, the idea moved to other places. So when you get to the 1880s, you're getting to play in. I'm in Australia. I would call them the hoi polloi, the people who are often well-to-do, got together and they decided to have rowing clubs. Well, the first rowing club was the Sydney Rowing Club, and I was a member of the Sydney Rowing Club per courtesy of my friend who had more attachments uh, to city living than I did, and but we crewed together, and we crewed uh, mostly in eights. Uh, so Sydney has a harbor which is an estuary. It's where water has flooded previous uh, eroded landscape. And so you have a very famous harbor, which is deep, but it has all these uh, islands coming down to the river, a little bit like Maine. And it helps, it really makes a place for sailing and for boating, whether it be boating in rowing style or boating otherwise. There's always a lot of motorboat traffic. It's a large enough estuary for ferries to ferry people across from one side of the harbor to the other. That estuary runs back perhaps 30 miles, and so the earliest settlement in Sydney was on a tank stream, and so the Sydney Rowing Club had a place there. Eventually got to be where all the ferries were coming in, so they had to move to Woolloomooloo, which was another place. And for years, a Sydney Rowing Club had a place in more or less the closely settled areas near to the downtown part of developing Sydney. Eventually, they bought land further inland, and that became a major resource. Some of these competitions were regattas between states or between different clubs. Sydney would probably have 5 or 6 rowing clubs. But it was an era when you had trams, and so the area that was settled for the Sydney Rowing Club as an adjunct was at the end of a tram line to a place called Abbotsford. My father grew up for some time on the other side of the now getting narrower Sydney Harbour. He was not born in Hunters Hill. He might have been born in Hunters Hill, which was across the way. In those days, if you had a vehicle, probably horse-drawn, you would take your horse across on a ferry, and the ferry would have a wire, a stanchion, and you'd have a wheel on that ferry, which would wind its way across. You had a motorized ferry, and it would wind its way across the harbor. But it was good and calm water, and good for rowing. It was reasonably sophisticated. The governors or the leaders of the community would be invited to promotionals, to regattas. It was, and I was warned when I went there to not say what sport I belonged to other than to rugby union. Rugby union is an amateur form of football. A rugby league, on the other hand, pays its players. I went to high school with uh, one fellow, Seth Nielsen, who was paid to go home each weekend and from the boarding school and play serious football, rugby league. So if you are going to become a member of the Sydney Rowing Club, however, you didn't mention that you were playing rugby league, you were playing rugby union. And it was an all-male affair, except that some women donated to the club and even became vice presidents of the organization. These sorts of clubs formed in the 1880s and kept rolling. When I was there were clubs at Mossman, there were clubs at the Middle Harbour, there were various clubs, and if you wanted, you could actually rent a, a, a boat for a team, as long as you were known to be responsible, and especially if you were a member of the Sydney Rowing Club, you would be in good shape. It is fun to row around Sydney Harbour in an 8. You have to dodge the various motorboats and ferries, and with the harbour and ferries, there's a little bit of waves, small waves, which might get into your boat if you're not very careful. So you just do that carefully, and you do row in unison. I don't know that they ever had songs the way that the railroad people put in railroad steel and moved it an inch. I think it was mainly the coxswain that called the event, or called the timing for putting your oars in. And that brings me back to the Chicago crowd. I think one leader in the community decided that it was much better to do things than to be in gangs and doing untoward things. And amazingly, he was able to bring together people who otherwise might be selling drugs or doing untoward things. But even in Chicago, this was a very sophisticated sport. So these people would appear at a regatta, and they were the only black people at the regatta, and they felt rather lonely. And some people retreated from this, but they eventually got to be very good at it, and they enjoyed it from that point of view. But they would have to go back home to a very different background. Their last row together was a national level row, and one of the organizers had gotten this together and been very loyal to it. It requires people getting together. You've got to get 8 people together, and they've got to get together at the same time. You just don't arrive late. So this required a discipline. And the leader of the push, instead of concentrating on his rowing for 1 second, he looked up to see. And often if you're in a regatta, you do this to see where the opposition is. Is it crawling ahead of you? And he did that, and he caught a crab. Well, the crab means that your oar goes into the water, and then it flies up, and it can almost lift you out of the boat, because you have to know that if you have 8 able-bodied people rowing at full speed, this is a fast-moving boat. Well, they were doing very well. It was anticipated they might win, but a crab was not uh, called for. They, however, recovered from the crab, and they caught up, and they were eventually they got to be uh, number 3, and they got into all sorts of public relations and got a lot of accolades from people for doing that. It is indeed a fun sport, especially if you get to be in condition and you can use your legs and thighs to push that seat back and move the oar. Uh, it's not unknown, but not usual to have women's rowing teams. And I actually coached a women's team for some time, and so the university had a women's rowing team. And, but my people lived on the escarpment of the Blue Mountains, and it was probably about 14 miles from Penrith, where there was a mountain ridge and a river called the Nepean River. And the Nepean River was running in a fault where part of the landscape had moved up and part had moved down. So it was very straight. And if dammed at one end, it made a tremendous, straight, very quiet water. And that's where often national regattas were held, international regattas were held, because the water was wide enough for 5 or so crews to crew at once. You didn't have to do something like time the time it took for a crew to get from one end to another. It had banks on either side, and you had the same picnicking and whatever has gone on for years. I enjoyed rowing there, and I enjoyed rowing further east in Sydney, where the Sydney Harbour was larger. I brought recommendations to the US. I didn't realize that if you put an 8 in a pond in East Central Illinois, it would hardly have room to move and let alone catch up speed and have a regatta. I did find that the lakes in New York were good at this, and I did find that simulation devices were here. If you didn't have a long lake to work in, you pushed water past people sitting in a simulated boat in the middle of this. So you had the feeling of working with a simulated river. I still have a T-shirt which says Nepean Rowing Club, and I've missed rowing for many years. Wisconsin does it. Wisconsin has rowing teams. The lakes there are a little bit rough, so you have to put up with a little bit of water occasionally. But this is a sport that is rather wonderful, but it's a little bit like golf. You have to have a pond to be able to work with it. This is not taking your self out into the ocean on the beaches to have life-saving clubs and being able to put your to body surf or to surf with surfboards. Australia has got the climate for this. It's got the uh, the water for this. If you're going to be doing surfing, you need waves. Hawaii is a good place for it. Some of the Caribbean places are good. So people who are big on surfing know where to go. My grandfather, my mother's parents, came from England to Australia, and my grandfather had been used to swimming in the English Channel, where the water is kind of warm because it comes up from Florida and across the Atlantic and up through towards Norway and Sweden. So it's calm. But my grandfather, first thing he did was to look at two beach points and try to swim between the two. So he had to be rescued by the life-saving clubs, which are there for that purpose, because people like to swim, but it's not always easy. The life-saving clubs will set a piece of the beach that is safe today. It doesn't have currents in it, and they will watch the swimmers swimming out there, but usually in a portion, but not between two headlands. The other thing that my grandfather didn't realize was that he was ginger and that the Australian sunlight is very intense, and he would lie in the sun and get sunburned. So my grandfather, who was a tailor of note in England, but and a tailor in Australia, in Bondi, which is a fairly famous beach. So I think that's enough about rowing. It's still a very respected sport, and especially if you're in the Sydney Rowing Club. I want to remind you that your prairies are at a peak. If you go to Meadowbrook or to the Barnhart Prairie or Route 45 or Lake Park prairies, they're blooming at the moment. The coneflowers, the purple coneflowers are almost done, but the liatris is there. And I would like to encourage you to go to some of these places. That's why we need visuals. We need the maps and the charts to tell you where to go. I'll tell you where to go to Rantoul, because we talk about it a lot. Rantoul, if you are using your imagination, is where 45, about a mile north of Rantoul, the modern Route 45 goes out and around a cemetery. That creates two triangles, one to the north and one to the south, that are in natural state. If you go towards Paxton, you're going to go up a gentle moraine, and that gentle moraine cuts through some of the rolling hills of a continental glaciation. The first road is called a section road. It's section number 3200, 3200, east-west. You turn in on that road and you go just 100 feet and you'll find an old Route 45. And there's a yellow gate that you can crawl under and go visit the prairie. So it's 18 miles from town, but it's low virus territory. You can go there, and if you know a little bit about your prairies, you'll be rather impressed. The area has part remnant where it hasn't been disturbed, and it's part gravel pit, which it has been disturbed. In cross section, east to west, you have a Canadian National Main Line that's active. Then you have a remnant of a interurban corridor that was a tram track for till about 56. Then you have an old Route 45, which goes all the way to Little Egypt, where towns got named after Egypt. So like you have Cairo, not Cairo, but Cairo. And it would take you 3 days on a corduroy road to get to southern Illinois. The corduroy is where you put down trees across a muddy part of the trail, and you could take your horse and cart or oxen across that without getting bogged. Now, if you want, you walk down that corridor for about 5 or 6 100 yards. You leave at the yellow gate a bunch of cottonwood trees, which are very typical of prairie. But when you go further down, you look across east to a prairie that should have, at the moment, and I haven't been up there this week, but it should have a range of prairie plants that have come in from remnant prairies on that old interurban and from the railroad line. So surrounding that borrow pit is remnant prairie. So it's much more rich in soil, and the prairie there looks much more natural than where the borrow pit is. The plants on the borrow pit are growing on raw gravel. So it's called regrowth succession. So the plant that might be 4 feet high on a more organic, more natural soil may be only 10 inches tall because it's struggling. And it's struggling through raw gravel that's been brought down by the marine, and it's got deep roots. So your favorite purple coneflower has about 4 feet of root. If it's a compass plant, it will eventually have about 10 or 12 feet of root. If it's a dock, you'll have a little less, but they find cracks in the soil. And amazingly, if you look at the soil on a dry day, it has hexagonal cracks, which I think are related to the crystalline structure of silicate aluminum, which is in the soil. And part of that comes from loess, which was wind-blown material blown across the state. So you can visit there. We don't have a lot of places for you to sit down. You would be advised to take Wellington boots because they come up to your knees and there are ticks. But if you're afraid of ticks, you're not going to see very much of a prairie. This was the center of the Grand Prairie for this region. Rantoul was very wet, and so you had prairie which can tolerate wetness. It can't tolerate too much, but it can handle quite a lot of wetness. And then in dryness, it can survive with drought, and sometimes those roots are down into aquifers and underground water supplies that keep them afloat. If you want, you can walk down and visit the cemetery. In the cemetery, you find the early settlement history, and with a little bit of knowledge, you can figure out who came here early, and if you have a plat book, you can see that those families still are here. South of the cemetery, there's a wonderful swampland that is not good for agriculture, but it would be very good for letting people know what this region looked like before settlement came. And I would love to take that swamp that almost goes back into Rantoul. It's in Ludlow Township, but you can go up the Bloomington Moraine to the top, and then gently down the backside of the Bloomington Moraine to Ludlow, and then on to Paxton. Being evil-minded in this setting, some of us are rather impressed by what other people have done, and then what we have continued at the Pope Prairie. It's named Pope Prairie because the Pope family had bought the triangle to the north so there's a visual corridor. You saw the billboard as you went around the bend that went around the cemetery. And when 57 was put in, that advertisement advantage was lost. So we'd been looking after this borrow pit for many years, and we would ask where we'd like to buy it, and yes. So we bought it. And we continue to look after it. There is 6 acres of vacant farmland a little to the south of our cemetery, our prairie, and we would love to buy that. And looking at 50 or 100 years, 200 years, it takes that sort of time for the prairie to fill in on the borrow pit. It's still there on the remnant areas, but we would like to keep that fairly pristine. We'd like to know what a borrow pit was, what a remnant prairie was like. But there's the 6 acres just below it, and that would help to extend that transect up and over the Bloomington Moraine. People don't know that this is their heritage, but it is, and this rolling continental glaciation, you other end of it is over there by Bloomington, and that's where it gets its name. So it's sheet glaciation, and it could be high, could have mammoths on it. Sometimes archaeologists find mammoth bones with spears in it, which would suggest that when the ice was on the glaciers, this was a place to be hunted by people who have their counterpart in Eskimo land. Gradually, as the world warmed, the level of the glaciation, which might have been in some places perhaps 200 feet high, but when it started to get warm, it would be perhaps 4 or 7 feet tall, and the water would run out in outwash plain creeks. So we have an outwash plain creek coming right through the Pope Prairie. It's interesting, it doesn't come through as a one-lane creek. It comes through as an abraded creek. That means its water has several different channels. Some of it goes underground and then comes out later. But it's very nice in that it provides us with some wetland place, and it goes through to the the next door where we'd like to reconstruct a prairie so it could be part of teaching. And we're not thinking of just uh, one time. We're thinking of 50 or 100 years or even more. So we're interested in people who, especially people who have families that might continue that interest. Not as a dominant thing, perhaps, but as a vocational interest. But you better watch out. If you get interested, you might get bitten by the bug and become a prairie nut. We're down to the state having preserved 0.01% of the prairie that we had. It's a very rich soil, good for farming, and the remnants are mostly near to or adjacent to railroad lines, where the law said you couldn't invade a railroad line and dig it up for agriculture or put beasts on it. It brings me to the fact that the Pope Prairie doesn't exist on its own. There's a 10-mile old Route 45 to Paxton, and Paxton has had a nickel plate railroad that went through it. So there's a railroad museum there that's closed but could be open. It has a Paxton moraine, which is quite high, that has to be negotiated with freight trains that had to have a pusher on the end to push them over the moraine. Now that has been made a cutting, and that gravel was actually brought down to raise the level of the railroad line through Champaign so that you could get cars underneath the railroad in underpasses. Now, if you're back at Pope Prairie and you want to go east and west, you can do so. If you go east of Pope Prairie on 3,200 section road, you first pass settlement of houses, because this moraine is perhaps 50 or 100 feet higher than the general terrain for Rantoul. And then there's rolling territory. The farmland to the south has lots of blocked drainage where the glaciers left kettles, low spots, and they're awkward block places where rainfall fills in, and if you planted corn in there, then you have to replant it after a rainstorm. Go a little further, there's a golf course, and part of it is on that rolling territory. A little further and you get to a landfall, and so if you're on top of the hill, you'd be amazed. You can look down on Rantoul. You can do that from the moraine, but when you put a landfill on top of a moraine and then you put soil on top of the landfill, you have an interesting place. It could be prairie. Many retired landfills, this is a retired landfill, have prairie on them and have prairie trails, and you have places where you can sit and look at the landscape and think about continental glaciation and what you do with climate change and what you do in the future. Some of the land that's nearby, the road that is a new 45, goes through a cutting, and both sides of the cutting have prairie plants on them. So there's also an old road that was going to be a dual highway, but 57 went in, so the highway was bought, and it was planted to ash trees. The ash trees have taken the ash borer, and underneath the ash trees, as the light comes in, there are prairie plants there too. So with a little bit of pizzazz, we could put together some of these roadsides and some of the drainage areas that have been set aside because they are not suitable for farming, and they're not suitable for draining onto roads. And we could go 10 miles to Paxton and have a nice prairie bicycle trail. So we're looking for people to be involved, to be interested, to take their car 18 miles and find this little prairie and start to think about it and figure what it is and how we might augment it over many years. If you do the same at Kankakee, you come to other features. You have also cemeteries, which often have settlement history, like at Larab, not too far from Kankakee. You have Cajun people that came in from Canada when they were being moved out of there. And so Larab has a rather unique church and cemetery details that say something about Cajun people. You have an Iroquois River where people in the Elliot Ness era would have contraband liquor and other places that were unique. One gentleman had a full-scale railroad around his house. Another had a place where he could baptize you on the banks of the Iroquois River. So we're thinking that in the long run, we might take visitors off 57 at Kankakee and bring them down past remnant prairies on the adjacent to the railroad line, past Loda, Buckley, where there is good prairie. The Grand Prairie Friends have been involved. Down to Paxton, where there's a fairly typical and fairly intact railroad town, and a prospect cemetery, which is unique, where there was set aside for graves that were never used it. And then the Grand Prairie Friends has part of that 10 square miles rented for the prairie that is there quite naturally. We're looking at adjunct space, and it can be cultural or natural, and it can also be recreational. It takes you a little energy to push your bike up and over the Bloomington Moraine. If you go south, you have a east-west rail trail that's 3 miles long, that is quite popular and very well used and developed. And we like to think that we could almost have a triangle from Pope Prairie to Rantoul to Dillsburg, then back to Pope Prairie, and then you could choose to go north to Rantoul, to Paxton, or south to Rantoul if you want. I'm watching the time. It's about time was run out. I would like some of you, if you're listening, to visit the Pope Prairie. You don't have to have us holding your hand. You can be there by yourselves and think of its future and keeping a little piece of prairie that is our heritage. And just check yourself out when you come home to see that you're not got livestock on you. But it's worth the visit. And I would encourage you, if you really want a guide, then call me up. My phone number is 217-840-1911. 840-1911. There are other people who spend much of their lives working on that prairie and preserving it and knowing it. And people like the Grand Prairie Friends, or the Master Naturalists, or the Natural History Survey and others use that site, and we would encourage you to know about it. This is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.